I have to tell you, this is the first time I've ever talked to a science department about faith. The first time ever. And I've lived 6 decades now, so that's quite a while. I've been in science for quite a while. And I had a little trouble with it, not because I didn't want to tell you about science and faith, but because to do this, I have to talk about myself. And I'm sure I've never given a talk anywhere that's about me. So I'm going to tell you about my science, I'm going to tell you about my faith, and then I think the reason you're here is you want to know how come I can study the origin of life and I can read the book of Genesis and get comfort from it. I think that's why you're here. So that's what I'm going to address. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am. Now, one thing I want to say, I'm going to have a little trouble with this. Okay, one thing I want to say is I would much prefer, and I think you would be very comfortable, if you have a question while I'm talking, don't be afraid to ask me, okay? How many biologists are in the room? Do you know what this is?
You have to describe things for me.
I'll describe things for you.
And I'm not a scientist either.
Okay, all right, I can do that. That's a little bit tricky, but I'll try to do it. Okay, some of you might have taken biology when biologists love to categorize things, right? We like to put things into categories. Well, we used to categorize things by just looking at them and saying which things look the most familiar. So if you see a chicken and a duck and you see a swan, those things are all categorized into a group. And if you were old enough, like me, then you had probably 7 categories. You talked about plants, you talked about animals, you talked about protista. Well, that was just based on looking at something. Well, back in the mid-70s, there were 2 men, a man named Carl Woese and another man named George Fox. He was his postdoc. They got some bacteria. You know what a bacterium is? They got bacteria from the Great Salt Lake. Somebody gave it to them. And at that time, we were just beginning to sequence DNA, okay? And in every living thing on this earth, there's an identifier molecule in it. It's called a 16S ribosomal RNA. That's not important. It's just an identifier molecule, right? So they were just at the forefront of being able to understand the sequence of DNA. When I say that, what I'm talking about is in your cells, there's DNA, and it's made up of an alphabet that has 4 letters, A, C, T, G. And they could go into a cell, get this identifier molecule out, sequence it, and compare it. And when they did that with a bunch of different organisms, some plants, some animals, some bacteria, these things out of the Great Salt Lake, they found out something revolutionary. They found out instead of that life being sort of categorized by what we see, it's only categorized into 3 groups: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. George and Carl didn't believe it when they saw this. They were shocked. They ended up, just like you know how things hit the news today, they were on the New York Times, they were invited to morning talk shows because this was a revolutionary way to think about all of life on the planet. This is everything that you see: plants, animals, mushrooms, ducks, grass, weeds, everything. This is the things that you go to the doctor because you've got a staph infection. It's also the things that cycle everything on our planet. It's the things that make oxygen on our planet. This was the category they didn't expect. This was that red bacterium they got out of the Great Salt Lake. Well, this was amazing. And what they decided was, if we understand this, now remember, this is just taking that identifier molecule just out of every living thing we had. But they thought, well, this is a family tree. This is telling us what things are more related to each other. If you want to do genealogy, you compare your mother and dad, and then their mother and dad, and then their mother and dad on both sides. Well, this is a genealogy of all of life on the planet. So the idea was, well, my goodness, if we can figure out what's going on down here, we know how life started. We've got the origin of life down here. How are we going to get to that? Well, that's the field of theoretical biology. Okay, so that's a tree that has 3 branches, okay? And they're labeled archaea, bacteria, and eukaryotes with that identifier molecule. All right. Did I change it? Okay. How many of you have ever heard of NASA? Everybody. NASA's an interesting entity. I want you to know, all of us Americans are really, really proud of the European Space Agency and that landing on the meteorite. That's just the coolest thing in the world. But of course, NASA feels like a lot of times they're sort of the king of the rock when it comes to space study. Well, billions of dollars have been put into space exploration and creating the mechanics and the technology to get any kind of landers or anything out into orbit. And the ostensibly, if I asked most of you in here, what were we looking for when we go out, we go to Mars, we go to the moon, what do you think we hope we see? Say it. Yeah, we hope we see life. Well, here's a bunch of engineers, technicians. They're the ones running the program. They don't have any idea what life's going to look like on the moon. They don't know. So NASA's very clever. They're kind of getting pushed. You know, well, how are you going to know if you see life? So they think, well, let's create a virtual institute where we say we can throw a little bit of money at it because we're going to do everything on the internet. We don't have to charge much. We can get all these experts together, these biologists, we can get these geologists together, the biochemists, we can get them together and we'll call it the Astrobiology Institute. So they put about 35 million into it and they picked Harvard, MIT, Caltech. They picked several actual NASA centers and they became the Astrobiology Institute. And the idea was, if we're going to try to find life on a planet, we've got to get enough people that have enough different disciplines together to actually think about it. Because if you're going to think about the origin of life, you've got to think about, well, what was the chemistry that was there, that was available, right? You've got to think about what was the physical terrain like. The whole idea is nobody in NASA even then really thought we were going to see little green men. What they thought we were going to see was maybe archaea or bacteria. All right. But what they didn't anticipate, I don't think, was what it would actually do to the field of those of us who were searching, sort of doing theoretical biology, what it would do for us, because it put us into contact with people we'd never been in contact with before. Now we're in contact with geochemists, biochemists, isotope chemists, people that understood geology. We could frame our biological questions in a context that made sense. We'd never had that opportunity before. So that was one of the very big things that, even though this was sort of a PR vehicle, it actually helped the group of people that were doing theoretical biology. So now not only were they just sort of, do you find the origin of life interesting? Right? Now not only could we satisfy that sort of natural curiosity that people have, now we had a little bit of money to do it, and we had collaborators. So currently, although I didn't tell Martin this, I'm part of a team that's at the University of Washington that's been part of this Astrobiology Institute called the Virtual Planet Laboratory. We have a website. You should go browse around. If you're a teacher, it's a great resource. It's a very interesting thing. The problem is it's a lot of modeling. Well, as a biologist, I like to inform models with data. Modelers don't really care. I don't know if any of y'all are modelers in here. I worked very closely with a modeler. He was a, you ready? Paleo-atmosphere chemist. Now, if you think they have trouble telling you what the weather's going to be like tomorrow, think about trying to tell me what the weather was 3 billion years ago, 4 billion years ago. But it's interesting work, right? It's very cross-disciplinary and it's very collaborative. And it was very good for me. Now, while all this is going on, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this in a minute. I was in graduate school. I was an older student in graduate school. And I went into George Fox's lab. George, the man that discovered those 3 domains. He's at the University of Houston. And because I'm an older student, I get assigned to the microbiology lab. I've never had a microbiology course in my life. I don't have any clue what's going on, right? And I've been out of school for 10 years because I've been a mother. I had 3 children. So I come back into graduate school. Not only have I missed microbiology courses, I've missed almost the entire blooming of the molecular biology field. Now, I don't know if you know anything about molecular biology. I'm just going to brag a little bit, I'm a pretty good cook. You know, I can throw stuff in, I can mix it, and I don't have to have a recipe. You cannot do that in molecular biology lab. It's a disaster. So I was totally incompetent in lab. But I was pretty good at computers. So lo and behold, since George is big into theoretical biology, I'm his computer analysis expert. We start thinking about problems, about what we can address, what we can think of, and then something really nasty starts to happen. Now not only can we take that identifier molecule out and compare it, now the technology is so good we can sequence the entire genome. And we find out something not so good. If we're concentrating on the fact that that origin of life down here at that root where those 3 branches were is the origin of life, and we're thinking about there's just vertical descent that gets us there, you understand what I'm saying? Something really awful happens. They start sequencing all of these entire genomes, and it turns out vertical descent is not what's happening all the time. In certain conditions, in certain organisms, there's something called horizontal gene transfer. They're just passing along genes in the environment. A cell can break open in the ocean. The DNA can spill out onto the ground or into the sediment or in the water, and it can last for days. There can be reasons that other bacteria go over there and pick it up. And what we're finding is that when you sequence the genome of an organism, well, it's got genes from something that's way over here on the other side of the tree. Well, that's not good for us theoretical biologists. We've got to figure out something to do with that. Well, I don't know how many of you, as a biologist, I can't be the only one in science where there's an argument among whose idea is the best, right? So there was this camp that said, well, yes, there's some genes that never get passed back and forth. We can count on those. No, everything gets passed back and forth. You can't count on anything. Me, the bad person in the laboratory, I'm thinking, well, why don't we just do the experiment and figure out what gets passed around? That seems easy to me. I mean, if it's happening, let's just check it out and see how it was. Okay, I wasn't any better at that kind of theory than I was in the lab. But I did run into something very fortuitously at a meeting I was in somewhere, and I was telling this guy, I think, let's just do some experiments that show us how often horizontal gene transfer happens. Let's just stick some genes in there and then see if they stay. And he said, I think you need to meet my friend who she's a Mexican microbiologist, and she's down at UNAM, which is the federal university for Mexico. So I think you need to talk to her because she's at this place called Cuatro Ciénegas. This place is extraordinary. So here was my idea. Forget this theoretical stuff. Let's just see what's actually happening in real time in a real place. This is about a 140 square mile oasis. It has a very extensive hydrologic system. Back in the 50s, an old kind of scientist, codger type guy from ASU goes down there and visits, and he starts looking around, he's thinking, wow, this place has tremendous numbers of endemic species. You know the word endemic? Endemic means they're only found there. You know the Galapagos? The Galapagos is famous because there's species that are found on the Galapagos that are not found anywhere else, right? Do you know what the theory of why that's the case? Somebody does. Come on. I bet you do. No? Surrounded by an ocean. It's an island in an ocean, and things can't get in or get out. So there's no input and there's no output. Well, I'm going to tell you where this is. This is about 10 hours from Houston. This is in the middle of the Chihuahuan Desert. This is not surrounded by water in any way. But it is surrounded by a very high mountain range that completely surrounds the place. Lo and behold, this place has the same level of endemism that the Galapagos does. I mean, there aren't very many places on the planet like that. Even the more interesting thing is the water system is exhibited, it comes up in little pools in different places all over the valley. So what we could do, let me tell you one more thing about it. it has a very unique chemistry. How many of you know the word stoichiometry? Okay, good. Stoichiometry is just the ratio of important elements in an environment. That's the easiest way I can describe it. So you've got to have, in order to have the right number of elements to do all the things in your body, it's better if you have a certain carbon-phosphorus ratio, right? Well, at this place, it's very, very low in phosphorus. There's something has happened here that this place is very, very low in phosphorus. And the idea was this is what's created all this endemism. But the good thing was we could go in, we could pick a pond that the government said we could use, and we could fertilize it. And then we could see what happens. We could change that ratio. We could change that stoichiometric balance and see what the difference was when it didn't have it and what happened when it did have it. Well, now why that's important is because what is the phosphorus molecule used for most in your body? There's two places it's used. DNA, ATP. That's exactly right. So that affects a microbial community in a very big way. If I have time later on, I'll tell you a little bit more about it. But the basic idea was we would go in and just understand completely what the microbial community was, whether it was bacteria or archaea, by sequencing something called metagenomes, sequencing whole genomes, looking for just that identifier molecule. We get all this data, and then we go in and throw more chemicals in it, and then see what had happened and what had changed. And what we were specifically looking for was if we could identify events of that horizontal gene transfer I was talking about, right? That was the point. I didn't even bother to show you any of the data. That has gotten so complicated. I mean, we're learning things, and we've picked up some of the horizontal gene transfer events, but it is a very difficult problem. But it's one of the few projects that actually looks at this process in real time in a real place. I wish you could see this picture because it's gorgeous. Do you think that's pretty? Do you think that's a pretty place? It looks like little pieces of the Caribbean were just set out into it. And if I have time later, I'll tell you, there's no coral here. This is fresh water. But bacteria make a coral-like formation that looks just like you're swimming among the reefs. And that's kind of unusual too. Okay, so this is one of the most boring slides I'm going to show you, but it's important for me. It's important for me to get a concept across because it's going to come in when I talk about faith in a minute. This is just another tree. This tree is a family history of a particular group of bacteria. And what it shows is that there's sometimes when you have one shape, which is bacteria are kind of boring. They're not interesting like trees or cactus. They usually come in only three kinds. They're round, they're sort of round, and they're rod. Okay, they're kind of boring, but that's actually when you go to the doctor, they're going to look at the morphology, which is what that's called, and they're going to identify it, at least in some. Well, when I was working with George and we were thinking about theoretical biology, I told him, I said, George, I have a feeling there's something in this data that we're missing. And he said, well, what do you think it is? I said, well, I think it has to do with shape. He said, shape? I mean, shape is not an important identifier now. I said, I know, but there's something there's an intuition that I have that I think what's happened is that there's a progression of morphology, and I think I can prove it. But he said, no, I don't know, so I showed it to him. We checked a little bit more, but it was my intuition that there was something in this data we were missing. So we published the paper, this was about 10 years ago, and lo and behold, within 5 or 6 years, an entire genetic system became known through some experimenters that proved this was exactly what was happening. Okay? Now, how many of you in here who are in science have ever known, I mean, you're working through a data set or you're trying to work through a puzzle or something, and you have an intuition that you have I hate to say feeling because it's not really an emotional feeling, but it's an intuition that there's something there you've got to tease out of that problem. Has anybody in here ever had that? Yeah, right? I mean, and do you second guess yourself and say, oh, well, now I'm not really sure, and that's kind of intuitive, so maybe I shouldn't even be thinking down it. What do? You go down that pathway, right? I mean, you think about that. Well, so that's sort of the end of the science part, except for I just want to explain to you. I was explaining that somebody asked me the other day, and they said, well, what do you actually do? I said, well, I get sequences, and I line them up, and then I run them through computer programs. And about this time, I know you have this with your friends and family. You're telling them about science, and they're watching you. They're, oh my gosh, when's she going to stop talking? And this person goes, wow, doesn't seem very interesting. I said, well, it's really not. The mechanics of it, the actual doing it isn't. But once you can put it into context, like we were trying to put the horizontal gene transfer events into context in the science, it's tremendously interesting. I mean, it's like opening a door. So, I'm just going to tell you, science, for the most part, I trust it. I think science is just wonderful. I think anything that you want to do, any project you want to do, if it's the origin of life, if it's studying horizontal gene transfer, if it's looking at stoichiometry, you're never going to, it's never a waste to take any kind of thought you have in your mind and try to pursue it. I trust science with the knowledge that this is how science works. You take data, you analyze it, and you provide a theory that explains that data. And if you're a really good scientist, when more data comes in, now you take another look at it and you see if you need to revise what you've said. That is how science works. That is beautiful, wonderful science. No matter what it is, no matter how extraordinary, like I showed you that it was revolutionary to think about those three groups, that life is grouped into three groups. It was revolutionary. But when horizontal gene transfer came in, we needed to understand that. We needed to understand if we had to revise that theory. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about faith, which to me, did you notice that very boring side that had the blue and yellow spheres to it? And I had them separated. I did that on purpose. I probably could have made it better, but I did it on purpose. To me, faith and science are separate. I think they are two different parts of who we are as human beings. My faith comes from the things that I have experienced personally that have to do with God and what I believe He has done in my life. I can't explain these to you by science. I can't make an experiment that says, this is what happened. Okay. I'm from Arkansas. Did any of you detect any kind of Arkansas accent? It's kind of a hillbilly accent. Was raised in something called Missionary Baptist Church, which was a very fundamental, very evangelistic denomination. I had a profession of faith at 13 after I went to camp, and I came home and told my dad. And I was very, very close to my dad. I was the oldest child, and he looked at me and said, well, I kind of figured that would happen. Well, that put a little bit of doubt in my mind. I kind of figured that would happen. What does that mean? Because you might not have noticed this either, but I'm quite emotional. I'm kind of, But my father was an alcoholic, and he was a severe alcoholic. And as close as we were, I was a little bit of his confidant. And I knew there were times when he did not want to drink so much he would kill. He thought about killing himself. I mean, he spoke to me about that. But at the age of about 14, he joined a group called Alcoholics Anonymous. And he did a lot of explaining to me about this. He said, well, there's a lot of people in Baptist Church, the Victory Missionary Baptist Church that I went to, did not agree with Alcoholics Anonymous because they spoke of a higher power. They did not speak of God. He said, but I'm going to tell you, my daughter, that the reason why I'm sober today is because a higher power is keeping me from drinking this day. Now, as revolutionary as that 3 domains were, I don't know if any of you have lived with alcoholism. That was a revolution in our family. It was a miracle. And he believed, his life changed, our life changed. I have faith because I believe in love. I have a son that passed away 9 years ago. His passing away did not affect that I still love him. My love didn't end with that. I can't explain to you that by science. I believe in sacrificial service. I had 2 sons that joined the Army and who served in Iraq. I believe in communication with God and prayer and the Bible. I believe in the community of Christian believers. I haven't told you the story of how I got into science, but just that alone to me is a pathway. I had no intention of going into science. I wanted to be a mother. And here's the thing that I thought about. People don't like to use the word supernatural. And I'm not talking about ghosts or seances or any of that stuff. But once you say you believe in something bigger than you, then you're talking about the supernatural. And if you don't agree with me, that's fine. But I don't know how I can't explain these things through science laws and experiments and rules, but I can explain them if my explanation has to do with their supernatural. They're beyond the laws of what I study in science. Okay? And one of the things in Origin of Life conferences, there's lots of conversation. And those Gordon conferences that Martin was talking about, those are, have you ever heard of a Gordon Research Conference? Okay, so there's a select group of 120 or 130 people, and you live and eat together for 24/7 for about 5 or 6 days. There's lots of conversation. And I would say that half of my friends are atheists that are in that group. But there's a good portion that will say, well, you know, having a creator that creates all this prior to what we know is not really any less plausible than any other sort of origin we could come up with. Well, the second you say that, the second you say there's something outside of this physical world, you've gone to the supernatural, as far as I can tell, by the definition I'm making. Okay. So, I trust it too. There's something in me. I told you when I was explaining that boring slide about the shapes of bacteria, that there was something that compelled me to look into that. I mean, there was something about the intuition I had about that. It's the same thing with those things I listed about faith. There's an intuition that what I'm thinking, what I'm seeing is telling me that there is a supernatural part to this world. There's a supernatural part to me. So I believe I have faith in both of them. So I mentioned what you want to know. See, I used a Venn diagram. You want to know about this part. Okay. Now here's where I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you a caveat. This is where I am. I go to a Baptist church in Houston that I love. I'm not representing them at this moment. This is me. This is where I am. I really don't think there's much connection between us trying to have a conversation that somehow makes faith and the things we know in the Bible and Genesis correspond to what we do in geology. I just don't think it is. The reason why is, and I don't know about here, but in the United States, that's a very volatile topic. And most people come to the table angry. They don't come respecting each other. They come mad. Both sides, science and faith, they come mad. What are you ever going to get? What are you going to ever get if you're mad before you ever even start talking? You're not going to get anywhere. Now, the caveat to that is if you have somebody that you're close to, that community, it doesn't have to be a believer, but you have somebody that you're close to, and they're willing to talk with you because they respect you and you respect them, that's nothing but good. That does nothing but help you. I don't think, well, it's not that I don't think, I feel certain in my heart that science doesn't answer the same questions that faith does. It's never going to. If you want me to try to prove how the origin of life happened or the planets, the solar system formed, I don't think God intends for me to use Genesis to explain that to you. I think I'm cheating Genesis because I think Genesis is telling me something else. It's telling me something else very important. Because of that, I don't believe that creation, Genesis creation, should be taught in public schools in the science department. I don't believe it should be taught as an alternative theory. Now again, I'm going to tell you this is my opinion. This is where I'm at right now. That does not mean that I don't think philosophy and theologies and the importance of faith and religion should be taught. I think it should be, and I'm going to tell you why. So the crossover for me is that I'm trying to show you the places where I think it does cross over, the few places. I honestly, through all of my career, have hoped that the Christian principles I try to live by imperfectly affect my ethical conduct with anybody I work with. My care of colleagues, atheists, agnostics, there are a lot of people that I'm very close to, despite what their religious or non-religious preferences are. I try to be honest in my work. I think open-mindedness as an intelligent thinking person, no matter what your degree is important. Whether you're a Christian or a scientist, both or neither. This is another thing that's probably a little tricky, but I do believe this. Where there is true factual history in the Bible, I don't believe God was sneaky and told lies about it. Now, somebody asked me about that and said, well, how are you reconciling the order of creation in Genesis? And I'm going to tell you why I keep believing this more and more. When I first got into the origin of life, there was a man named Bill Schopf. He was out at UCLA. Kind of a blowhard, but always fun to listen to. And he'd gone down to Australia and he'd found some rocks, and he got out of these rocks fossils that looked like a particular kind of bacteria that were 3.7 billion years old. When I got into the origin of life field, this was like God had written this, right? I mean, this was a rule. You could date anything from this point where this man said this happened. It's all over the papers. 10 years later, a guy named Martin Brazier from here in England completely debunked it. Now, I'm okay with that. That's that process I talked about, right? But just because what's happening right now in early Earth history, what we understand our theories for it, doesn't mean someday down the road things won't seem more closely related than what they are. That's just, now, that logic might not suit you. But I'll be honest with you, it does suit me, because I've just seen too many times when we've had to completely radically change the way we thought about something that we thought would never change. The field of archaeology is very, very different than any other science. Any archaeologists in here? I wrote a proposal about a year ago, and I called it a soft science. And one of my collaborators said, I don't think you should be calling it soft science. I said, well, they call it a soft science. That is the one place in science where I have seen faith and religious preference actually affects the way the science is done. And I know this firsthand. I went on an archaeology dig about 2 years ago, and I never realized the camps in the archaeology. How many of you have sent a peer-reviewed paper in? Yeah? Okay. Well, you know, the process of that is you're supposed to be sending this paper in to this journal that you have no affiliation with, and they're going to send it out to some of your peers. They're going to look at it, and if it's deemed worthy to print, you're going to print it. You know what happens in archaeology? One set of journals is owned by one group of archaeologists that believe one thing, and one other group is owned by the others. They're the editors. They do the publication costs. Well, one of them is trying to follow the Bible, and one of them is not. That's one place where I think, not in a good way, faith and science have tried to mix. And then it's that intuition I was trying to say. I was trying to think, how do I tell you, I'm not going to try to convince you of anything, but how do I tell you why I can be a scientist and why I can be a believer? Well, the reason is because that intuition I was trying to say that I use in science, it's intuitive to me about the faith I have. They're the same. It's the same part of me that's responding to those two things. And then I believe in progressive revelation, which to me as a scientist is sort of what you're doing whenever you're re-looking at your theories and adding more data to them, or when you're a Christian and you've grown up with theologies that could be good, could not be good, could be used in a different way, and you're progressively seeing how God reveals to you in His Bible. Okay. About 3 more slides and then we'll be done. So I thought it might be interesting to you to see a couple of people that were in the origin of life field that I became friends with that were not religious. But my life was richer because of having been around them. This is Juan Oro, and he was a biochemist from Catalonia. As you can see, he participated in several NASA missions, including Apollo and the Viking lander. He's a little short guy, kind of flirty, and don't take that anyway, but he was. We were on the elevator one day, and he said, "Janet, you ever thought about what intuition is?" I said, "Well, I guess not." He said, "It's the unconscious, subconscious connection of facts that you would never put together just thinking about them." I think that's a good explanation of intuition. I think that's a good explanation of why it works in science, and I think it's a good explanation of why it works in faith. Yes, intuition is the subconscious connection of facts that seem unrelated if you were consciously thinking about them. So it's another part of your brain that's sort of actually working. Juan Oro just had a nice, happy smile on his face. He was a little bit older, about a 70-year-old. Now this was another guy. His name was Leslie Orgel. He was born in London, degree in chemistry with first-class honors from Oxford. Started his career as a theoretical and inorganic chemist. Continued his studies in this field at Oxford, the California Institute of Technology, and the University of Chicago. When I met Leslie, he was about, I'm going to say he's probably close to 80. And I met him at some of these Origin of Life conferences, and he loved to play tennis, and he had that beautiful British accent, he had that beautiful melodious voice, and he was very much an avowed atheist. One of the kindest, gentlest, most thoughtful, most intellectual men I've ever known. And we used to play tennis together. It was always fun to get with him. We were sitting in a conference and we were waiting for the people to get on, and he leaned over to me and he said, now he was not in any way saying anything about faith. I don't want to say something, I don't want to put words in his mouth that weren't there. He leaned over to me and he said, have you ever thought about how evolution doesn't really seem to work in some ways? I said, what are you talking about? And he goes, well, you know, we're both getting older. I said, well, I'm not quite your age yet, but so we're both getting older. And he said, we have nothing to lose. Why don't we just take every chance we can? Why don't we just blow caution to the wind and just work? He said, and these young people, your kids, my grandkids, they have everything to lose. He said, that's not the way evolution should be working in the human spirit, is it? Well, again, now he wasn't saying anything about God. But to me, what he was saying is, as human beings, we have to know why we are here. The process of evolution is not sufficient to explain why we have the feelings and the longings that we do. Okay. I miss Leslie. Leslie died not too long ago. What about the Bible? Well, how many of you ever heard it's inaccurate? Come on, you've all heard that, right? I mean, everywhere you go, you hear it's inaccurate. I am not a Bible scholar. After my son died, I actually joined a Sunday school class. It's just been something that I needed. I wanted to know the things that I was brought up as a Victory Missionary Baptist Church young girl. What did I really believe and what was really true? What did the Bible really say? Well, just fortuitously, joined this class, got introduced to a bunch of biblical scholars, and sort of the whole world of actually what the Bible is made up of started to come alive. So I was looking through some websites the other day, and I was trying to figure out, well, what exactly are people saying that's inaccurate about the Bible? And I started looking, and I realized, you know, they were just sort of counting errors that had to do with the way maybe things were copied, what Greek was done, maybe a different verb, maybe something was transposed. I mean, those kind of, that's the errors that they're including, right? Okay, now I'm going to give you an example of how if I had done that same kind of analysis on my sequences. Basically, I'd take that identifier molecule that's got a lot of things that tell me what the important parts of it are and what the parts that are not important. But instead of trying to line that all up, trying to make sure I'm comparing the right things to the right things, making sense of what's important and what's important, I just threw that whole thing into my computer and said, just tell me how many differences there are. I'm going to tell you, I could not get a journal in this world to publish that paper. Not a single one. If I have not intelligently looked at what I'm saying the differences are, I'm not going to get that published. It's not good science. To just quantitatively say there's X number of errors in the Bible and not make those kind of good analysis that I'm talking about would not pass muster in science. Another thing I've thought about is it's sort of dismissed, right? If you're not a Christian, the whole concept of the Bible being something that's passed down is just dismissed. I'm totally convinced that if we didn't have the religious and the political connotation to the Bible, and some scientists found several copies of it like this, we'd think we'd found a gold mine. We'd think we'd found something that just, it'd be like those 3 domains. You'd think you'd found something that was revolutionary. So to dismiss it is not an intelligent thing to do. Now, if you've analyzed it like I'm talking about, and then you've determined it should be dismissed, come talk to me about it. I want to hear that. But if you haven't done that, if your friends have looked at it and said, well, I've heard on the news that, it's got a lot of errors in it. I don't know. The concept of fidelity, how many of you know what a ribosome is, or you know how DNA is copied in the cell? I don't know if you know this, but there's a particular error rate that goes along with that copying. It's built into it. It makes errors. That's sort of how you have diversity. I have a suspicion that if you looked at the error rate of those particular molecular machines that are copying, I bet it's higher than the error rate here when you look at the right things. Nobody's done that experiment, but I bet this got more fidelity to it. Okay. I was thinking the other day when I was trying to think about what I wanted to say to you, and I don't know how many of you are Christians or how many of you aren't, or I don't know. But along with things that I believe that we all hold in common, and if you were at Mark's lecture last night, and you should watch it online if you weren't, I do believe that there is an objective right and wrong that's built into us. I believe that there is, no matter where you are or who you are, there is a need to know why you are here and why you're important. But I also think one of the reasons why there's so much conversation about Christianity today, that people that don't like it, is because the other thing that's built into us, we want the truth. We want to know what the truth is. You don't want to be lied to. You don't want somebody to tell you the truth. So, let's see if this works, Larry. I like to watch TV and movies. If this show comes on, I watch it every time. I hope this shows.
Colonel Jessup, did you order the code red?
You don't have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question. You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Well, I think some people can't handle the truth. I love that. My youngest son kind of looks like Cruz. Thank goodness he doesn't act like him, but anyway. So what is the future? Well, I think, I've never lived any other lifetime, but this lifetime to me seems like it's just absolutely amazing. We are in a place where you don't have to be a Greek or Hebrew scholar, you don't have to be a scientist, you don't have to be, there is so much information, so much good information available to you if you use your mind and open it up. It's just absolutely incredible. I don't think that science supports the human need to understand our place in reality. And I think when scientists actually, this is one of the things that as a scientist I hope I can make a difference in. You cannot deny people their needs when it comes to faith and religion. And you can't try to say that's less than what it is, because all through human culture, people have needed to know that. There's not a culture on the planet, anything we've ever known, that hasn't needed that. So I think that's a very bad thing that Dawkins and all of them do. they try to say that science supplants all that. There's no evidence that supports that, none that I can see. Here's the other thing, and again, this is my opinion. I'm not a representative of my church right now. I think Christians should believe in practice what they say they believe. They should not be afraid of the truth of science. If you believe God is who He is, there is nothing that's going to prove He's not. You should stand on that. And one of the things that worries me, I think it's the worst, and if I was very good at quoting Bible scripture, I could quote the scripture. Dale could probably do it for me. But apathy is not a valuable trait in humanity, whether you're in science or you're a believer. Apathy is devastating. Okay. I'm going to end with this. I wish you could see how gorgeous this is. You've seen the flyers around. The two little girls are over here and they're looking at the galaxies out there. Just one last story. I told you I was close to my father. In Arkansas, we go frog gigging. And that means that you take this fork that kind of looks like a pitchfork, a devil's pitchfork, and you get in a boat and you try to find where the frogs are, these great old big bullfrogs. And my job was to shine the light on them where my dad gigged them. And we put them in a tow sack and we went home and cooked them. Well, that was our ritual on my birthday, was to go frog gigging. Well, in Arkansas, we have an Arkansas River, and we have something called bar pits. So they have to try to make it so it doesn't flood. So they were always dredging out soil to put up against the river, and that left a bar pit that filled up with water, and the frogs loved it. So that's where we always went. Well, I remember one night he'd taken me out, and we talked about religion, we talked about God, we talked about his sobriety. And like I said, I'm kind of emotional, and we were sitting, it was dark, we'd finished, and he'd built a campfire, we were sitting there, and he said, "What's the matter with you?" And I said, "What if there is no God?" That was, I was kind of afraid of my dad too, so that was kind of a big admission. And I remember, he wasn't the least bit surprised. He wasn't the least bit worried. He said, "Don't worry, God will take care of it." Well, I remember how scary I felt. I was out there in this, out there on that bar pit, it was dark and their lights are over there, and I'm thinking, what if there is no God? Well, I'm going to tell you, this actually tells you where I am now. I am that young woman that he knew I would turn, or I'm not a young woman, I'm that old woman he turned into that he knew. I just find joy in understanding how the galaxies work, thinking about how they evolved, but also knowing who's up there in there, who's beyond all of it. That's it.